On March 23, 2013, the French presidency announced that DNA testing had confirmed the death of Mohamed Gadir, known by his nom de guerre Abdelhamid Abu Zeid. The testing took place in an Algiers laboratory, analyzing remains recovered from a remote valley in northern Mali. The confirmation ended weeks of speculation about whether one of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb's most disciplined commanders had survived a massive military operation designed specifically to eliminate him. Abu Zeid's death came after a pursuit that involved drone surveillance, intercepted radio communications, precision airstrikes, and ground combat in some of the most inhospitable terrain in the Sahara. French intelligence had tracked him from Timbuktu, where he had governed as an administrator implementing Sharia law, into the Adrar des Ifagkas Mountains, a granite maze of caves and boulder fields that had served as a jihadist sanctuary for years. The hunt culminated in a battle that lasted over a month, pitting modern military technology against fighters defending positions they knew intimately. What made Abu Zeid a priority target was not just his operational role but what he represented within the organization. Unlike other commanders who balanced ideology with pragmatism, Abu Zeid remained a rigid enforcer of Al-Qaeda's directives. He executed hostages when governments refused his demands. He destroyed cultural heritage sites because his interpretation of Islam deemed them polytheistic. He expelled rivals from the organization when they deviated from Central Command's instructions. His loyalty to the AQIM leadership in northern Algeria made him both effective and dangerous, a commander who would implement orders regardless of local consequences or international backlash. The question is not why Abu Zeid became a target. The question is how a former smuggler from the Algerian desert transformed into the primary architect of a kidnapping economy that generated tens of millions of euros, and how that success positioned him to govern a major West African city before a coalition of foreign powers mobilized to remove him. Mohamed Gadir was born on December 12, 1965, in Taougert, a city in eastern Algeria surrounded by desert. The location shaped his early development. Taougert sits at the edge of the Grand Erg Oriental, a massive sand sea that extends into Tunisia and Libya. Growing up in this environment provided Gadir with knowledge of desert navigation, an understanding of cross-border movement through terrain where national boundaries existed more as administrative concepts than physical barriers, and familiarity with the logistics of surviving in regions where water sources and reliable routes determined viability. His initial engagement with political activism came through the Islamic Salvation Front, a party that sought to establish an Islamic state in Algeria through electoral means. The FIS gained massive support in the late 1980s and early 1990s, capitalizing on widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling National Liberation Front's economic management and secular orientation. Municipal elections in 1990 gave the FIS control over hundreds of local governments. Parliamentary elections in December 1991 put the party on track to win an absolute majority in the National Assembly. In January 1992, the Algerian military intervened, annulling the election results and forcing President Chadli Benjedid to resign. The military justified the coup by arguing that allowing the FIS to take power would result in the dismantling of Algeria's secular state and the establishment of a theocracy incompatible with democratic principles. Thousands of FIS members were arrested. The party was banned. Political channels for Islamist activism closed completely. For Gadir and thousands like him, the coup represented a fundamental betrayal. They had participated in the electoral process, accepted the rules of democratic competition, and won. The military's intervention invalidated not just the election, but the entire framework of peaceful political change. The conclusion many drew was that the Algerian state would not permit Islamic governance through any legitimate means, making armed struggle the only remaining path. Gadir joined the Armed Islamic Group, an organization that emerged from the post-coup chaos with a strategy of total war against the Algerian state. The GIA's campaign quickly escalated to indiscriminate violence. The group carried out massacres of civilians in villages suspected of supporting the government, killed intellectuals and journalists, targeted foreigners, and declared vast segments of Algerian society to be apostates deserving death. The violence of the 1990s, often called the Black Decade, resulted in an estimated 150,000 to 200,000 deaths. In 1996, Gadir's brother was killed, though the specific circumstances of his death remain unclear in available records. The loss appears to have intensified Gadir's commitment to the armed struggle. Personal grief combined with ideological conviction to deepen his involvement in the insurgency at precisely the moment when the GIA's extreme violence was producing internal fractures within the jihadist movement itself. The personal dimension of radicalization often receives insufficient attention in analyses focused on ideology or strategic calculation. Gadir's trajectory suggests that individual losses and grievances reinforced broader political narratives about state oppression and the necessity of violent resistance. The death of his brother would have created obligations within family and community structures to seek justice or revenge, obligations that aligned with the ideological framework the GIA provided for understanding and responding to violence. By 1998, significant portions of the GIA's membership had concluded that the organization's indiscriminate massacres were both morally indefensible and strategically counterproductive. The violence against civilians had alienated potential supporters, provided the Algerian government with justification for brutal counterinsurgency measures, and created divisions within the jihadist movement between those who accepted the massacres as necessary and those who viewed them as violations of Islamic law. Hassan Hadab, a former GIA commander, led a breakaway faction that became the Salafist Group for Preaching and Combat. The GSPC's founding statement explicitly rejected the GIA's targeting of civilians and promised to focus exclusively on Algerian military and government targets. The split was not a renunciation of jihadist ideology but a tactical refinement, an attempt to wage insurgency in a way that would not generate the same level of popular revulsion that had isolated the GIA. Gadir joined the GSPC, aligning himself with this more focused approach. Within the new organization, he leveraged his Saharan background to advocate for expanding operations into southern Algeria, a region that the GIA had largely neglected in favor of operations in the more densely populated northern areas. The Sahara offered strategic advantages: vast ungoverned spaces where government security forces had limited presence, established smuggling routes that could support logistics, and proximity to borders with Mali, Niger, and Mauritania that could provide sanctuary if Algerian pressure became too intense. The GSPC's southern expansion under commanders like Gadir, who now use the name Abdelhamid Abu Zeid, transformed the group's geographic footprint. The organization established camps in remote desert regions, built relationships with local communities, and began integrating into the trans-Saharan smuggling economy that moved cigarettes, weapons, and eventually drugs across the region. Abu Zeid's knowledge of desert terrain and his connections to smuggling networks made him valuable to the GSPC's southern strategy. The group's operations in the south also brought it into contact with a different set of potential recruits. Northern Algeria's insurgency drew primarily from urban and peri-urban populations, with grievances related to economic exclusion and political repression. Southern Algeria's potential recruits included Tuareg and Arab populations with different grievance structures related to marginalization by the central government, economic neglect, and disputes over resource access and land rights. Abu Zeid's ability to navigate these local dynamics became increasingly important as the GSPC established itself as a presence in the Saharan belt. The distinction between the GSPC and the GIA was significant for operational purposes, but masked continuities in personnel and ideology. Many GSPC members, including Abu Zeid, had served in the GIA and participated in its campaigns. The split represented disagreement about tactics and targeting rather than fundamental ideological differences. The GSPC's claim to focus on military targets was partly aspirational and partly strategic messaging designed to differentiate the group from the GIA's toxic reputation. The Saharan expansion also reflected practical necessity. Algerian security forces had become increasingly effective at suppressing insurgent activity in northern regions through a combination of military operations, intelligence penetration, and co-option of former militants through amnesty programs. The South offered space where the GSPC could rebuild capacity outside the reach of concentrated security forces, while maintaining the option to conduct operations in the North when opportunities arose. In January 2007, the GSPC officially merged with Al-Qaeda, rebranding itself as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. The merger was not merely symbolic. It represented a strategic decision to link a nationalist Algerian insurgency to the global jihadist movement led by Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri. The rebranding brought ideological benefits, operational guidance, and access to Al-Qaeda's global network of financing and expertise. For Al-Qaeda, the GSPC merger provided a foothold in North Africa at a time when the organization was under intense pressure in Afghanistan and Pakistan. AQIM could extend Al-Qaeda's geographic reach, conduct operations against Western targets in the Sahel, and potentially establish a base area in the vast ungoverned spaces of the Sahara that could serve strategic functions similar to what Afghanistan had provided before 2001. For the GSPC leadership, the merger provided legitimacy and resources. Aligning with Al-Qaeda transformed them from a group focused on Algerian domestic issues into participants in a global movement. The change attracted foreign fighters, unlocked funding from the broader jihadist fundraising network, and elevated the group's profile in international jihadist circles. Abu Zeid became commander of the Tariq ibn Ziyad Brigade, a mobile unit operating primarily in the Saharan regions. The name referenced the Berber general who led the Muslim conquest of Iberia in 711, invoking a historical narrative of Islamic expansion into Western territories. The brigade functioned as the vanguard of AQIM's southern operations, conducting kidnappings, establishing checkpoints, and projecting AQIM authority in regions where the Algerian state had minimal presence. The ideological evolution that accompanied the Al-Qaeda merger shaped Abu Zeid's approach to operations. He adopted a rigid interpretation of the organization's objectives, viewing every action through the lens of the global struggle against Western powers and their regional allies. This ideological rigidity distinguished him from other AQIM commanders who maintained more flexible approaches that prioritized local relationships and financial gain over strict adherence to Al-Qaeda doctrine. The Bay'ah, or Oath of Allegiance, formalized the relationship between individual commanders like Abu Zeid and the Al-Qaeda leadership. This tribal-style allegiance system created vertical chains of loyalty that bypassed formal organizational structures. Abu Zeid's oath bound him to Abdelhamid Abu AQIM's overall emir who operated from hiding in northern Algeria and through Droughtel to the central Al-Qaeda leadership. The system meant that Abu Zeid's operations, while conducted hundreds of miles from AQIM headquarters, were conceptually integrated into a global strategy directed from the top of the organization. The merger transformed operational possibilities in concrete ways. AQIM gained access to training materials, bomb-making expertise, and tactical guidance developed through Al-Qaeda's global operations. The organization could now frame its actions as part of a worldwide resistance movement rather than a localized insurgency, a narrative shift that helped with recruitment and fundraising. The Al-Qaeda brand carried cachet among potential recruits who viewed joining the organization as participation in the most significant jihadist movement of the era. The transformation also brought complications. The Algerian focus that had motivated the original GSPC membership had to be reconciled with Al-Qaeda's global agenda. Some commanders resisted the shift, preferring to maintain focus on overthrowing the Algerian government rather than attacking Western targets in the Sahel. The tension between local and global objectives would persist throughout AQIM's existence, with different commanders emphasizing different aspects of the organization's mission depending on their own priorities and circumstances. Between 2003 and 2013, AQIM Saharan brigades, with Abu Zeid's unit playing a central role, abducted more than 20 Western nationals. The kidnappings evolved from opportunistic crimes into a sophisticated industry with established procedures, negotiation protocols, and financial infrastructure designed to maximize returns while managing risks. The first major operation occurred in 2003, when European tourists traveling through the Algerian Sahara were seized by what was then still the GSPC. The kidnapping and subsequent ransom payment established a template that would be refined over the following decade. Hostages were held in remote desert locations where rescue attempts would be logistically difficult. Negotiations were conducted through intermediaries, often local tribal leaders or religious figures who could facilitate communication while providing plausible deniability to European governments that officially maintained no-concessions policies. Abu Zeid's approach to kidnapping was methodical. His units utilized local intermediaries from Tuareg and Arab communities who scouted potential targets, provided intelligence about movement patterns, and facilitated the actual abductions. Aid workers, tourists, diplomats, and employees of foreign companies operating in the Sahel all became potential targets. The selection criteria balanced accessibility against ransom potential, with European nationals preferred due to their government's willingness, despite official denials, to pay substantial ransoms. The revenue generated was massive. Estimates suggest AQIM collected between 50 and 70 million euros from ransoms between 2003 and 2011. Individual European hostages could generate approximately 5 million euros each. The money flowed through networks of intermediaries, with portions going to the specific brigade that conducted the kidnapping, portions sent to AQIM central leadership as organizational tribute, and portions distributed to local communities and tribal leaders as payments for cooperation and silence. European governments faced a fundamental dilemma. Official policy across most European states prohibited ransom payments on the theory that paying ransoms incentivized future kidnappings and funded terrorist operations. In practice, governments frequently authorized payments through various mechanisms designed to maintain plausible deniability. Money was channeled through third-party intermediaries, disguised as humanitarian aid or development assistance, or paid by insurance companies ostensibly acting independently of government direction. The ransom economy transformed AQIM's operational capacity. The organization purchased heavy weapons including DSHK anti-aircraft machine guns, acquired fleets of vehicles suitable for desert operations, established supply networks, and paid salaries to fighters that far exceeded what they could earn through legitimate employment in the impoverished Sahel. Recruitment became easier when AQIM could offer consistent payment in a region where formal economic opportunities were scarce. Abu Zeid's use of ransoms extended beyond organizational expenses. In areas where AQIM operated, the group paid inflated prices for goods, sometimes double the market rate for staples like goats and fuel. This strategy served multiple purposes. It generated goodwill among local populations who benefited economically from AQIM's presence. It created dependencies as communities became accustomed to the economic benefits of hosting the group. It provided intelligence, as merchants and suppliers who profited from AQIM's presence had incentives to share information about government movements or potential threats. The financial infrastructure supporting the kidnapping economy was complex. Money had to be moved across borders, converted between currencies, distributed to operatives, and invested in assets that could store value and generate returns. AQIM utilized informal banking networks, smuggling routes, and relationships with corrupt officials to move funds. The organization invested in real estate, purchased stakes in legitimate businesses, and maintained cash reserves in multiple locations to ensure operational continuity if specific assets were seized. The scale of the kidnapping industry created its own vulnerabilities. European governments eventually recognized that their ransom payments were funding AQIM's expansion and began coordinating efforts to reduce payments and to punish intermediaries who facilitated transactions. Insurance companies that had provided coverage for kidnapping and ransom started excluding coverage for payments to terrorist organizations. Intelligence agencies improved tracking of ransom payments, identifying intermediaries and financial networks that could be targeted for sanctions or prosecution. The industry also created tensions within AQIM between those who viewed kidnapping primarily as a revenue source and those like Abu Zeid who saw hostages as tools for advancing ideological objectives. The tension between financial pragmatism and ideological commitment would shape how different commanders approached negotiations and would eventually contribute to the fractures within AQIM's Saharan wing. What distinguished Abu Zeid from other AQIM commanders was not the kidnappings themselves, which were conducted by multiple brigades, but how he used hostages as tools of ideological enforcement rather than purely financial assets. Other commanders treated kidnappings primarily as business transactions, negotiating for the best possible price and generally releasing hostages once payment was received. Abu Zeid introduced political demands into negotiations and demonstrated willingness to execute hostages when his conditions were not met. In May 2009, Abu Zeid's unit captured Edwin Dyer, a British tourist traveling in Niger. Rather than simply demanding ransom, Abu Zeid added a condition. The British government must release Abu Qatada, a radical Islamic cleric held in a UK prison, in exchange for Dyer's freedom. The demand was non-negotiable and had no realistic prospect of being met. The British government had been fighting a lengthy legal battle to deport Abu Qatada to Jordan on terrorism charges and had no intention of releasing him in response to a kidnapping. When the deadline passed without the British government agreeing to Abu Zeid's demand, he ordered Dyer's execution. The killing was announced through AQIM's media channels and served multiple purposes. It demonstrated that Abu Zeid's threats were credible and would be carried out regardless of the consequences for future negotiations. It sent a message to other Western governments that purely financial negotiations were insufficient when dealing with him. It satisfied the ideological requirement to punish governments that refused to submit to jihadist demands. The execution of Mitchell Germanow in July 2010 followed a different pattern, but reflected the same willingness to kill hostages in response to political and military developments. Germanow, a French national, had been captured along with other hostages. French Special Operations Forces attempted a rescue operation, though Germanow was not at the location targeted. Abu Zeid characterized the rescue attempt as a violation of the negotiation process and executed Germanow in retaliation. The killing was presented as a proportional response to French military action. From Abu Zeid's perspective, if France was willing to use military force in an attempt to free hostages, he was justified in killing hostages to demonstrate the costs of such decisions. The execution served as a deterrent to future rescue attempts, signaling that any military intervention would result in hostage deaths even if the intervention itself failed to reach the hostages. These executions distinguished Abu Zeid as particularly ruthless even within an organization known for violence. Other AQIM commanders criticized the decisions, arguing that killing hostages reduced the organization's ability to generate ransom revenue and damaged relationships with intermediaries who facilitated negotiations. Abu Zeid's position was that ideological consistency and demonstration of resolve were more important than short-term financial considerations. His willingness to sacrifice ransom payments to make political points reflected his commitment to AQIM's stated objectives over the pragmatic criminal entrepreneurship that motivated some other commanders. The executions also reflected a calculated assessment about deterrence and reputation. Abu Zeid understood that his credibility as a negotiator depended on governments believing he would follow through on threats. If he consistently backed down when governments refused his demands, future negotiations would be undermined, as governments concluded his threats were empty. By executing hostages, he established a reputation for inflexibility that paradoxically might have strengthened his negotiating position in subsequent kidnappings, as governments would understand that meeting his demands was the only way to secure releases. The ideological framing of hostage executions served propaganda purposes beyond the immediate negotiations. AQIM could present the killings as demonstrations of principled resistance to Western pressure, contrasting their willingness to sacrifice financial gain for ideological objectives with the perceived weakness of governments that paid ransoms to secure releases. The executions became recruiting tools, demonstrating AQIM's commitment to confronting Western powers regardless of cost. The internal dynamics of AQIM's Saharan operations were shaped fundamentally by the competition between Abu Zeid and Mokhtar Belmokhtar, a rivalry that eventually fractured the organization and contributed to its operational challenges during the 2012-2013 Mali crisis. Belmokhtar brought credentials that Abu Zeid lacked. He had fought in Afghanistan against Soviet forces in the 1980s, placing him among the generation of jihadists who participated in what many viewed as the formative conflict of modern global jihad. His Afghan experience gave him connections to Al-Qaeda's historic core leadership and prestige within the broader jihadist movement. He operated with a level of autonomy that reflected both his seniority and his indispensability to AQIM's operations. Belmokhtar's approach to operating in the Sahel emphasized local integration and financial pragmatism. He built deep relationships with tribal leaders, married into local families, and established himself as a figure embedded in Saharan social networks rather than an external jihadist imposing foreign ideology. His involvement in smuggling operations, particularly cigarettes, earned him the nickname Mr. Marlboro and generated revenue streams independent of AQIM's central treasury. This financial independence gave him leverage in disputes with the leadership. Abu Zeid represented a different model. He was a local Algerian without the Afghan credentials that conferred automatic respect in jihadist circles. His authority came from his organizational position and his loyalty to AQIM's central command rather than from personal prestige or independent power base. He implemented directives from the leadership and enforced discipline on commanders who deviated from organizational policy. The AQIM leadership in northern Algeria viewed Belmokhtar as both valuable and problematic. His operational success and local connections made him effective, but his independence and tendency to prioritize personal projects over organizational directives created control problems. Abdelhamid Abu Zeid, AQIM's overall emir, used Abu Zeid as a counterweight to Belmokhtar, assigning him responsibilities in geographic areas that overlapped with Belmokhtar's zones and effectively creating a system where the two commanders competed for influence, resources, and credit for operational successes. The competition manifested in various ways. Both commanders sought to conduct high-profile kidnappings that would generate ransom revenue and organizational prestige. Each tried to build relationships with the same tribal intermediaries and local power brokers. They competed for recruits, weapons, and vehicles. The rivalry became personal, with Belmokhtar reportedly dismissing Abu Zeid as a mere smuggler who lacked real jihadist credentials, while Abu Zeid characterized Belmokhtar as a criminal more interested in personal enrichment than in advancing AQIM's ideological objectives. The tension reached a breaking point in late 2012. The AQIM Shura Council, the organization's leadership body, formally accused Belmokhtar of financial impropriety and indiscipline. The specific charges included withholding ransom payments that should have been sent to the Central Treasury, conducting operations without authorization, and engaging in backbiting against other commanders. Abu Zeid played a significant role in the process that led to these charges, functioning as an enforcer for the central leadership's authority. In November 2012, Belmokhtar was expelled from AQIM. The expulsion was announced through official channels and represented a dramatic rupture within the organization's Saharan wing. Rather than submitting to the decision, Belmokhtar formed his own independent group, initially calling it Those Who Sign in Blood and later rebranding as Al-Murabitin. His new organization conducted operations autonomously from AQIM, most notably the January 2013 attack on the In Amenas gas facility in Algeria that resulted in the deaths of dozens of hostages and militants. The fragmentation created by the Belmokhtar-Abu Zeid rivalry weakened AQIM at a critical moment. When French forces intervened in Mali in January 2013, The jihadist groups controlling northern Mali could not present a unified command structure or coordinate their response effectively. Belmokhtar's independent status meant his resources and fighters were not available to AQIM forces defending against the French offensive. The rivalry that had simmered for years contributed directly to the military defeats that followed. The personal dimension of the rivalry reflected broader organizational tensions within AQIM about centralization versus autonomy. The leadership in northern Algeria wanted tight control over Saharan operations to ensure resources flowed to the organization rather than being diverted by individual commanders. Commanders in the field wanted operational flexibility to respond to local conditions and to exploit opportunities that arose. The tension between central control and field autonomy is common in insurgent and terrorist organizations, but in AQIM's case, it produced a split that significantly degraded operational capability. The rivalry also illustrated how personal relationships and status competitions shape organizational dynamics in ways that can override rational strategic calculation. Both Abu Zeid and Belmokhtar understood that their competition weakened AQIM, yet neither was willing to subordinate his own position to achieve organizational unity. The pursuit of personal status and the desire to prove superiority over a rival took precedence over what might have been better for AQIM's strategic objectives. The collapse of the Malian state in early 2012 created the opportunity for AQIM to transition from a guerrilla force conducting hit-and-run operations into an organization attempting territorial governance. A military coup in Bamako in March 2012 removed the democratically elected president and created a power vacuum that Tuareg separatist forces exploited to seize control of northern Mali. Jihadist groups including AQIM, MUJAO, and Ansar Dine, which had been operating in the region, quickly moved to either ally with or supplant the Tuareg rebels. By late March 2012, AQIM forces had entered Timbuktu. Abu Zeid was appointed as the city's governor, making him responsible for administering a population of approximately 54,000 people in one of West Africa's most historically significant cities. The position required different skills than commanding a mobile brigade in the desert. He had to establish administrative structures, provide basic services, manage relationships with local tribal and religious leaders, and implement AQIM's vision of Islamic governance. The governance model Abu Zeid implemented followed what AQIM documents later recovered from Timbuktu called the Blueprint for Control. The blueprint rested on 4 pillars: guns, money, prayers, and social ties. Each pillar served a specific function in establishing and maintaining control over a population that had not invited AQIM's presence and had no inherent loyalty to the organization's ideology. The guns pillar involved providing security in a context where the Malian state had completely withdrawn. Abu Zeid established a phone hotline that Timbuktu residents could call to report crimes, banditry, or harassment. AQIM fighters responded to these calls, investigating complaints and punishing offenders. In a city that had experienced a breakdown of law enforcement, AQIM's willingness to provide security, even security based on harsh Sharia punishments, addressed a real need. Residents who might have opposed AQIM's ideology nevertheless used the hotline because it was the only mechanism available to address immediate security concerns. The money pillar leveraged the ransom revenue AQIM had accumulated over the previous decade. The organization distributed food aid, provided access to cellular phone networks, and paid for various public services. They acted as a charitable organization, positioning themselves as benefactors who cared about the population's welfare. The economic distributions created dependencies. Families that received food aid or financial assistance had material reasons to tolerate AQIM's presence even if they disagreed with the group's ideology or methods. The prayers pillar focused on religious influence. AQIM empowered local Islamic scholars who were sympathetic to their interpretation of Islam, providing them with vehicles, money, and organizational support to preach and teach. They established religious courts to adjudicate disputes according to Sharia law. They promoted a specific interpretation of Islam that aligned with Salafist jihadist ideology while marginalizing or suppressing religious leaders who advocated different interpretations. The social ties pillar involved integrating AQIM fighters into local social structures through marriage. Fighters were encouraged to marry women from Timbuktu families, creating blood relationships and kinship obligations that bound the organization to the local community. These marriages were not merely personal arrangements, but strategic tools for building long-term presence. Children born from these marriages would have local family connections that transcended AQIM's organizational existence. The implementation of this blueprint was overseen by Abu Zeid, but occurred within constraints imposed by AQIM's central leadership. Documents recovered after AQIM's ouster revealed that Droughtel had instructed commanders in Mali to exercise restraint in implementing harsh Sharia punishments. The leadership understood that excessive brutality would alienate the population, provoke international intervention, and make long-term governance impossible. The guidance indicated a tension between ideological commitment to implementing full Sharia law immediately and strategic recognition that gradualism might be necessary. Abu Zeid's administration reflected this tension. AQIM in Timbuktu was relatively restrained in corporal punishments compared to MUJAO, which controlled Gao and carried out numerous public amputations for theft. However, Abu Zeid showed no restraint regarding the destruction of religious heritage sites. Timbuktu contained numerous Sufi shrines and mausoleums, structures built over centuries to honor Islamic scholars and saints. These sites were central to Timbuktu's identity as a center of Islamic learning and attracted pilgrims from across West Africa. From Abu Zeid's Salafist perspective, the shrines represented shirk, the sin of polytheism. Venerating saints or seeking intercession through shrines violated the principle of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. The shrines had to be destroyed regardless of their historical or cultural significance. Under his governance, AQIM systematically demolished the structures, using pickaxes and sledgehammers to reduce centuries-old mausoleums to rubble. The destruction was documented and publicized, serving both ideological and propaganda purposes. The destruction shocked international observers and galvanized opposition to AQIM's presence in Timbuktu. UNESCO designated the sites as endangered world heritage, and the international community began discussing potential military intervention to protect cultural heritage even before concerns about AQIM's southern advance toward Bamako made intervention urgent for security reasons. The governance experiment in Timbuktu demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of jihadist territorial control. AQIM proved capable of providing basic order and services, addressing some genuine needs that the collapsed Malian state had failed to meet. The organization's wealth allowed it to act as a benefactor in ways that built some level of local acceptance. However, the ideological rigidity that drove shrine destruction and the imposition of harsh punishments for violations of Sharia law created resentment and opposition that prevented AQIM from achieving genuine popular support. The attempt at governance also revealed internal tensions within AQIM about objectives and methods. The central leadership wanted to establish long-term control and recognized that this required building local support through gradual implementation of their vision. Abu Zeid's commitment to immediate implementation of full Sharia, particularly regarding shrine destruction, conflicted with this gradualist approach. The tension suggested that even within a hierarchical organization bound by oaths of allegiance, commanders retained significant autonomy in how they interpreted and implemented directives. In January 2013, jihadist forces controlling northern Mali began advancing southward toward Bamako. The advance threatened to extend jihadist control beyond the Saharan regions into Mali's more densely populated and economically productive south. The movement toward the capital triggered the French decision to intervene militarily, launching Operation Serval on January 11. The intervention had multiple objectives. The immediate goal was to halt the jihadist advance and prevent the collapse of the Malian state. The broader objectives included reclaiming the major northern cities of Timbuktu, Gao, and Kidal from jihadist control, neutralizing the leadership of the various jihadist groups operating in the region, and creating conditions that would allow Malian security forces to reassert control over the north. French forces deployed rapidly, utilizing air bases in Chad and France's permanent military presence in West Africa as staging areas. The operation employed approximately 4,000 French troops supported by Chadian forces, Malian government forces, and eventually contingents from other West African nations. The French contribution included mechanized infantry, special operations forces, attack helicopters, fighter aircraft, and unmanned aerial vehicles for reconnaissance and surveillance. The initial phase focused on stopping the southern advance. French aircraft struck jihadist columns moving toward Bamako, destroying vehicles and forcing the fighters to retreat. Within days, the immediate threat to the capital was eliminated. French and Allied forces then began the process of reclaiming the northern cities, entering Timbuktu and Gao with relatively limited resistance as jihadist forces retreated rather than defending urban positions where they would be vulnerable to French air power. Abu Zeid's response to the French intervention involved a strategic retreat. Rather than attempting to hold Timbuktu against a vastly superior force, he withdrew his fighters into the Adrar des Ifagas mountains in northeastern Mali near the Algerian border. The decision reflected sound tactical judgment. Urban defense against an enemy with complete air superiority and superior firepower would have resulted in the destruction of his forces. The mountains offered terrain advantages that could partially offset French technological superiority. The Adrar des Ifagas had served as a jihadist sanctuary for years. The range consists of low granite hills, typically 500 to 900 meters in elevation, covered with boulder fields and honeycombed with caves. The terrain is extremely difficult for mechanized forces, but ideal for infantry defense. Fighters can establish positions in caves and among boulders that provide protection from airstrikes and allow ambushes of ground forces attempting to clear the area. Water sources exist in certain valleys, allowing forces to sustain themselves for extended periods. French intelligence tracked Abu Zeid's retreat using multiple collection methods. Harfang and Reaper drones provided continuous aerial surveillance, tracking vehicle movements and identifying potential hiding locations. Signals intelligence intercepted radio communications between jihadist commanders, providing information about their locations and intentions. Human intelligence from local populations, some of whom were willing to provide information about AQIM movements, supplemented the technical collection. The intelligence picture indicated that approximately 600 jihadist fighters had retreated into the Ifaqa's range, with Abu Zeid commanding a significant portion of that force. The French command identified him as a priority target whose elimination would degrade AQIM's capability and send a message about the costs of attempting to establish territorial control in the Sahel. The French approach to targeting Abu Zeid demonstrated the integration of intelligence collection and strike capabilities that characterized modern counterterrorism operations. The drone surveillance provided persistent monitoring that could track individuals over time. The signals intelligence allowed analysts to identify specific commanders by voice and to map command relationships. The ability to strike targets rapidly once they were identified meant that intelligence had immediate operational value rather than simply contributing to long-term understanding of enemy networks. The technological advantage that France brought to the operation was overwhelming. AQIM fighters had small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and heavy machine guns. They had no air defense capability beyond small arms fire, no ability to prevent surveillance, and no protection against precision-guided munitions. The asymmetry meant that any position AQIM established could be destroyed once identified, and that movement during daylight carried extreme risk of being observed and targeted. Despite this asymmetry, Abu Zeid and his fighters chose to defend the Ifaqa's mountains rather than dispersing into smaller units that might have had better chances of survival. The decision reflected both tactical calculation and ideological commitment. Tactically, the terrain offered the best available defensive positions. Ideologically, retreating further would have represented abandonment of the goal of maintaining a presence in Mali and acknowledgement of defeat. Abu Zeid's communications to his fighters emphasized the importance of standing firm and inflicting casualties on the French and their allies even if ultimate victory was impossible. The climactic battle for the Adrar des Ifaqas focused on the Amatedei Valley, a region within the mountain range that jihadist forces had fortified. The battle began in late February 2013 and continued through early March, representing the most intense combat of Operation Serval. The terrain favored the defenders. The valley's granite formations provided natural fortifications that were difficult to destroy even with precision munitions. Caves offered protection from aerial bombardment. Boulder fields created natural mazes that channeled attacking forces into kill zones where defenders could engage them at close range. The jihadist forces had prepared defensive positions, establishing overlapping fields of fire and stockpiling ammunition and supplies. The initial assault came from Chadian forces approaching from the east on February 22. Chad had contributed a battalion to the intervention force, and Chadian troops had significant experience operating in desert terrain similar to the Ifaqa's range. The initial advance encountered immediate resistance. Jihadist forces engaged the Chadian troops with small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least one suicide bombing that killed multiple attackers. The intensity of the resistance surprised the attacking forces. Despite being outgunned and lacking air support, the jihadist fighters defended their positions with determination that suggested they understood retreat was not an option. 26 Chadian soldiers died in the first days of combat, representing the heaviest casualties suffered by coalition forces during the entire operation. The losses forced a reassessment of the approach to clearing the valley. French forces adjusted their tactics, relying more heavily on air power to reduce jihadist positions before committing ground troops. Rafale and Mirage jets conducted precision strikes on identified defensive positions. Tiger attack helicopters provided close air support, engaging targets with rockets and cannon fire. Caesar self-propelled howitzers, positioned approximately 25 miles from the valley, provided artillery support with GPS-guided munitions that could strike specific coordinates with minimal collateral damage. The combination of artillery and air power degraded the jihadist defenses but could not eliminate them entirely. The terrain provided too much cover for airstrikes alone to be decisive. Ground forces had to enter the valley to clear remaining positions and confirm that the area was secure. French Special Operations Forces and Foreign Legion troops began methodical clearing operations, moving through the boulder fields and investigating caves while supported by overhead surveillance and on-call fire support. Abu Zeid's location within the valley became the focus of intensive intelligence collection. French signals intelligence intercepted his radio communications, during which he urged his fighters to continue resistance and to fight to the death rather than surrender or retreat. The intercepts provided targeting information, allowing French forces to narrow their search to the southern portion of the valley where Abu Zeid appeared to be directing operations. On February 25 and 27, French aircraft conducted intensive strikes on the southern valley using a combination of precision-guided bombs and cluster munitions designed to clear personnel from open areas and trenches. The strikes were followed by ground probes to assess the results and locate any surviving fighters. After the February 27 strikes, Abu Zeid's voice disappeared from intercepted communications, suggesting he had either been killed, wounded, or forced to cease radio transmissions. On March 2, after 8 hours of close combat, Chadian troops recovered a body from the southern end of the valley. The recovery operation itself was dangerous, conducted under the possibility that remaining jihadist fighters might target the recovery team. The body was extracted and transported to a location where initial identification procedures could be conducted. Field identification was complicated by the condition of the remains and by the deliberate practice among some jihadist commanders of carrying false identification documents. Positive identification required either distinctive physical features that witnesses could confirm or biometric analysis comparing the remains to known samples. In Abu Zeid's case, Algerian authorities possessed DNA samples that could be used for comparison. The remains were transported to Algiers where laboratory testing began. The process required several weeks to complete, during which speculation about Abu Zeid's fate circulated in media reports and intelligence assessments. French officials expressed confidence that he had been killed, but did not make official confirmation until the DNA results were available. On March 23, 2013, the French presidency announced that DNA testing had confirmed the remains were those of Mohamed Gadir. The confirmation ended the uncertainty and allowed French officials to claim a significant success in Operation Serval. The announcement specified that the identification was certain, using language designed to preclude doubt or alternative interpretations. The battle for Amatete Valley demonstrated both the capabilities and limitations of modern military technology in counterinsurgency operations. French forces possessed overwhelming firepower, complete information dominance, and the ability to strike targets with precision from standoff distances. These advantages allowed them to destroy jihadist positions and to minimize their own casualties. However, the terrain and the defenders' willingness to fight to the death meant that clearing operations required weeks of sustained effort, and that complete elimination of all fighters was difficult to achieve even with technological superiority. The Chadian casualties highlighted the continued importance of infantry in clearing operations, even when technology dominates other aspects of combat. Drones and aircraft could identify positions and strike them, but confirming that positions were cleared and that no threats remained required soldiers moving through dangerous terrain and engaging any remaining fighters at close range. The risk to these ground forces remained substantial despite the technological advantages that supported them. AQIM's reaction to Abu Zeid's death was notable for its delay and ambiguity. The organization did not immediately confirm or deny that he had been killed. This silence extended for months, creating confusion about whether AQIM was unable to confirm his status, was deliberately withholding confirmation for strategic reasons, or was experiencing internal paralysis that prevented the organization from issuing an official statement. Several factors could explain the delay. The tribal allegiance system that structured AQIM's internal relationships created complications around announcing martyrdom. A commander's death required acknowledgement from the leadership to whom he had sworn allegiance. If Droughtel was unable to communicate securely or was himself under pressure from Algerian security forces, the process of confirming Abu Zeid's status and issuing an official martyrdom statement would be disrupted. Strategic considerations might also have motivated silence. Confirming Abu Zeid's death would hand the French a propaganda victory and acknowledge that Operation Serval had successfully eliminated a senior commander. Maintaining ambiguity about his fate prevented the French from claiming unqualified success and kept open the possibility, however remote, that Abu Zeid might reappear and demonstrate that the French announcement was premature or false. The delay also suggested potential succession disputes within AQIM's Saharan wing. Abu Zeid's death created a leadership vacancy that would need to be filled. Different factions might have competing candidates for the position, and the process of resolving internal disagreements could take time, particularly in an environment where secure communication was difficult and French military operations were ongoing. When AQIM eventually acknowledged Abu Zeid's death, the statement praised his dedication to the organization and his role in advancing jihadist objectives in the Sahel. The announcement characterized him as a martyr whose sacrifice would inspire continued resistance against Western intervention. The language was formulaic, following patterns used for other fallen commanders, and provided no details about the circumstances of his death beyond acknowledging that he had died fighting. The organizational dynamics revealed by AQIM's delayed response highlighted vulnerabilities in hierarchical terrorist organizations, operating across large geographic areas with limited secure communication. The death of a senior commander should trigger immediate succession processes and public messaging to maintain organizational cohesion and morale. AQIM's inability to respond quickly suggested that the organization's command and control structures were more fragile than its public statements suggested, and that pressure from French operations had degraded its capacity to function as a coherent organization. Abu Zeid's elimination did not destroy AQIM or end the instability in northern Mali. The organization survived his death and continued operations, demonstrating resilience that reflected structural factors beyond any individual commander's importance. The blueprint that Abu Zeid had helped implement in Timbuktu created local relationships that persisted after his death, and after French forces reclaimed the city. Marriages between AQIM fighters and local women produced children who remained in the community. Local leaders who had cooperated with AQIM, whether voluntarily or under coercion, maintained connections to individuals who had left the city but might return. Economic dependencies created during AQIM's governance did not disappear immediately when the organization's territorial control ended. The financial infrastructure that AQIM had built through kidnapping ransoms remained partially intact. Money that had been distributed to tribal intermediaries, invested in businesses, or hidden in caches could still be accessed by surviving commanders. The organization's ability to generate revenue through kidnapping decreased substantially after 2013 as international pressure to stop ransom payments increased, and as security conditions in the Sahel made it more difficult to hold hostages for extended periods without risk of military intervention. However, AQIM adapted by diversifying into other criminal activities including drug trafficking and protection rackets. The fragmentation that had weakened AQIM during the French intervention became, paradoxically, a factor in its survival. The split between Belmokhtar's group and the main AQIM organization meant that no single military operation could destroy the entire jihadist network. Different groups could operate independently, compete for resources and influence, and occasionally cooperate when objectives aligned. This decentralization made the overall jihadist presence more resilient even as it reduced the capacity of any single group to project power on the scale that AQIM achieved in 2012. The underlying conditions that allowed AQIM to gain influence in northern Mali were not addressed by the military intervention. State weakness, ethnic tensions between different population groups, disputes over resource access and political power, economic marginalization of northern populations, and the absence of effective governance in remote areas all continued after Operation Serval concluded. These conditions created ongoing opportunities for jihadist groups to position themselves as alternatives to a state that many northern populations viewed as predatory or indifferent. The broader Sahel region experienced escalating violence in the years following Abu Zeid's death. Groups affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State established themselves in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The violence spread beyond the Saharan zones into agricultural areas, affecting populations that had previously been insulated from jihadist activity. The casualty counts from terrorist attacks and counterterrorism operations increased substantially, suggesting that the jihadist threat metastasized rather than being contained by the 2013 intervention. The persistence of jihadist violence despite the elimination of senior leaders like Abu Zeid illustrated fundamental limitations of the decapitation strategy. Killing leaders disrupts organizations temporarily and can degrade operational capacity in the short term. However, organizations that have established local roots, diversified revenue sources, and built networks of relationships can survive leadership losses by promoting new commanders and adapting their methods to change circumstances. The French military presence in the Sahel became semi-permanent after Operation Serval, evolving into Operation Barkhane with expanded geographic scope and continuing counterterrorism mission. The need for sustained military presence to prevent jihadist resurgence demonstrated that the initial intervention had not resolved the underlying conflicts, and that maintaining security required ongoing external support that Sahelian governments could not provide on their own. The role of ransom payments in funding AQIM and enabling the organization to build the capacity that led to the 2012 Mali crisis sparked debate among policymakers about how to address kidnapping as a terrorist financing mechanism. The debate involved fundamental questions about whether paying ransoms ultimately saved lives by securing hostage releases or cost lives by incentivizing future kidnappings and providing resources for terrorist operations. European governments faced the dilemma directly because their citizens were the primary targets of AQIM's kidnapping operations. Countries including France, Spain, Switzerland, and Austria all paid substantial ransoms to secure releases, though they typically denied doing so publicly or claimed the payments came from private sources rather than government budgets. The payments were justified as necessary to save innocent lives and to fulfill the government's obligation to protect its citizens. Critics of ransom payments argued that the short-term humanitarian benefit of releasing individual hostages was outweighed by the long-term costs. The ransom money funded AQIM's military buildup, purchased weapons and vehicles that were used in the 2012 offensive, and attracted recruits by demonstrating the organization's capacity to pay salaries. The payments created incentives for AQIM to conduct more kidnappings, putting additional European nationals at risk and perpetuating a cycle where paying ransoms generated conditions for future kidnappings. The British government's refusal to negotiate for Edwin Dyer's release exemplified the alternative approach. British policy prohibited ransom payments or prisoner exchanges in response to terrorist kidnappings. The policy reflected a calculation that submitting to terrorist demands would encourage future attacks on British nationals and would provide resources and encouragement to terrorist organizations. Dyer's execution demonstrated the human cost of maintaining that policy, but British officials argued that the policy's long-term benefits in deterring kidnappings justified the tragic outcome in individual cases. Efforts to establish an international consensus against ransom payments faced significant obstacles. Countries that had paid ransoms were reluctant to publicly acknowledge doing so, making it difficult to build political support for changing practices. Governments faced domestic political pressure to secure the release of hostages, particularly in high-profile cases where families conducted media campaigns and where public opinion favored negotiation over rigid adherence to no-concessions policies. A group of African and Arab governments proposed banning ransom payments through international agreement, arguing that such a ban would eliminate the financial incentive for kidnapping and would require all governments to accept the cost of the policy rather than allowing some countries to free-ride by maintaining public no-concessions positions, while others paid and bore the criticism. The proposal generated discussion but did not result in binding international commitments, as European governments proved unwilling to formally commit to policies that would prevent them from acting to save their citizens' lives in future crises. The debate remained unresolved at the time of Abu Zeid's death and continues today. Kidnapping persists as a terrorist financing mechanism in multiple regions. The tension between humanitarian obligations to individual hostages and strategic considerations about long-term effects continues to produce different national approaches and ongoing controversy about what policy actually serves the goal of protecting citizens and reducing terrorism. The economic analysis of the ransom problem revealed collective action challenges that made coordination difficult. Individual governments face strong incentives to pay ransoms to free their own citizens, even if they recognize that collective adherence to no-payment policies would reduce overall kidnapping. The structure resembled a prisoner's dilemma, where defection from a cooperative policy produced immediate benefits while imposing diffuse costs on the broader international community. The amount of money AQIM accumulated through ransoms had multiplier effects beyond the direct use of funds for weapons and salaries. The financial resources allowed AQIM to establish legitimacy by providing services and acting as a benefactor in communities where it operated. The money funded the governance infrastructure that Abu Zeid implemented in Timbuktu. It paid for the vehicles and communication equipment that allowed AQIM to coordinate operations across vast distances. It provided the working capital that allowed the organization to engage in other profitable activities by funding initial investments in smuggling operations and building relationships with corrupt officials. Several aspects of Abu Zeid's final days and death remain unclear despite the DNA confirmation. The uncertainties reflect the chaotic nature of combat in remote terrain, the limitations of intelligence collection even in heavily surveilled battle spaces, and the deliberate ambiguity that various parties maintained about specific events. The precise mechanism of Abu Zeid's death is not definitively established in available records. French official accounts attributed his death to a combination of airstrikes and ground combat pressure that prevented escape from the valley. Field reports from the battle mention mysterious explosions in the southern end of the valley around the time Abu Zeid's communications ceased, leading to speculation that he might have detonated explosives, either as a defensive measure that went wrong or as a deliberate suicide to avoid capture. The possibility of suicide complicated the narrative. French authorities would have preferred to claim that their forces killed Abu Zeid in direct combat, demonstrating the effectiveness of their operations. If he instead died by his own hand, Whether accidentally or deliberately, the narrative became more ambiguous. Jihadist organizations often characterize any death in combat as martyrdom regardless of the specific mechanism, but they also sometimes deny responsibility for deaths caused by premature detonations or other operational failures, describing them euphemistically as work accidents. The A-Tower firefight on March 2 that preceded the body recovery suggested intense close combat rather than a simple retrieval operation. If Abu Zeid was already dead from previous airstrikes, the duration of combat required to reach his body indicated either that his fighters continued defending the position without knowing their commander was dead, or that the terrain and remaining defensive positions made any movement through the area extremely dangerous regardless of who was alive. The condition of the remains required DNA testing for identification, suggesting damage that prevented visual identification by witnesses who knew Abu Zeid. Combat in the valley involved high explosive munitions, cluster bombs, and artillery fire that could dismember or burn bodies. The need for laboratory analysis to confirm identity was consistent with death by aerial bombardment or explosion rather than small arms fire in ground combat. The strategic implications of uncertainty about the exact circumstances of death were minimal compared to the confirmed fact of death itself. From a military perspective, whether Abu Zeid died from an airstrike, ground combat, or his own explosives mattered less than the verified elimination of a high-value target. From a propaganda perspective, various parties emphasized different aspects of the narrative depending on what served their messaging objectives. The intelligence trail that led French forces to Abu Zeid raised questions about operational security within AQIM. The fact that his radio communications were intercepted suggested either that AQIM lacked secure communication equipment, or that Abu Zeid prioritized operational control over communication security. The ability to track his movement from Timbuktu to the Ifakaz Mountains indicated that either human sources were reporting his location, or that technical surveillance was more comprehensive than AQIM commanders realized. The broader uncertainty about how many AQIM fighters were killed in the Amatedai Valley and how many escaped reflected the difficulty of conducting battle damage assessment in complex terrain. French forces could confirm that specific positions had been destroyed and that bodies had been recovered, but determining the total number of casualties required combining direct observation with intelligence estimates that involved significant uncertainty. Some fighters who entered the valley undoubtedly escaped, either during the battle or in its immediate aftermath, dispersing into the desert and making their way to safe havens. Abu Zeid's career illustrated how ideological commitment combined with organizational loyalty can create particularly effective and dangerous commanders within terrorist networks. His value to AQIM came not from charismatic leadership or strategic innovation, but from his willingness to implement directives regardless of consequences, and to enforce discipline on commanders who deviated from organizational policy. The loyalty he demonstrated to the AQIM central leadership distinguished him from more autonomous commanders who treated the organization as a resource to be exploited for personal benefit. Abu Zeid operated within the command structure, accepted direction from Draughtel, and viewed his role as executing the organization's strategic vision rather than pursuing independent objectives. This made him reliable from the leadership's perspective, but also made him rigid in contexts where flexibility might have produced better outcomes. His ideological rigidity manifested most clearly in his treatment of hostages and in his destruction of cultural heritage sites. Other commanders who viewed kidnapping primarily as a business were willing to release hostages for purely financial ransoms, and to avoid actions that would generate international backlash disproportionate to any tactical gain. Abu Zeid introduced non-negotiable political demands and followed through on execution threats, prioritizing ideological consistency over financial optimization or pragmatic relationship management with intermediaries. The shrine destruction in Timbuktu served no operational purpose and generated international opposition that contributed to the momentum for military intervention. A more pragmatic administrator might have delayed or foregone the destruction to reduce international pressure and extend AQIM's territorial control. Abu Zeid proceeded with destruction because his interpretation of Islamic law required it, demonstrating commitment to ideological purity over strategic calculation. This combination of loyalty and rigidity made him valuable to AQIM's leadership during the organization's expansion phase, but also made him a liability when circumstances required adaptation. The attempt to govern Timbuktu revealed tensions between implementing full Sharia immediately and exercising the strategic restraint that Draughtel recommended. Abu Zeid struggled to balance these competing imperatives, moving forward with shrine destruction while showing relative restraint on corporal punishment. The internal competition with Belmokhtar demonstrated both Abu Zeid's utility as an enforcer and the costs of the internal rivalries that the leadership's management approach created. Using Abu Zeid to counter Belmokhtar's autonomy solved the immediate problem of a commander who operated too independently, but the eventual split weakened AQIM at a critical moment when unity might have allowed more effective resistance to French intervention. His death removed a disciplinary mechanism from AQIM's structure. Without Abu Zeid to enforce central directives and to counterbalance autonomous commanders, the organization's cohesion in the Sahel depended more heavily on commanders' voluntary compliance with leadership guidance. The subsequent trajectory of AQIM and the proliferation of splinter groups suggested that the organization struggled to maintain the level of command and control that Abu Zeid's loyalty had helped enforce. The enforcer role within terrorist organizations serves critical organizational functions, but also creates vulnerabilities. Enforcers implement unpopular policies, discipline wayward members, and ensure compliance with leadership directives. However, their actions can generate resentment within the organization, can create enemies who might defect or cooperate with authorities, and can make the enforcer a particularly valuable target for counterterrorism operations that seek to disrupt organizational cohesion. Abu Zeid's effectiveness as an enforcer depended partly on the credibility of his threats. His willingness to execute hostages when demands were not met established that his commitments were genuine. His role in expelling Belmokhtar demonstrated that he would follow through on disciplinary actions even against prominent commanders. This credibility made him effective at maintaining order within AQIM, but also made him dangerous to anyone who crossed him or the leadership he served. Operation Serval achieved its immediate objectives of preventing jihadist forces from taking Bamako, reclaiming the major northern cities from terrorist control, and eliminating or dispersing the jihadist fighters who had concentrated in the Adrar des Ifagkas. French forces withdrew most of their troops by mid-2014, transitioning to a smaller counterterrorism mission that continued targeting jihadist leadership. The broader stabilization of Mali proved more difficult than the initial military success suggested. The Malian state remained weak, unable to project authority effectively into northern regions even after French forces removed the jihadist presence. Ethnic tensions between different population groups, particularly between Tuareg communities and the central government, remained unresolved and periodically erupted into violence. The jihadist groups adapted to the changed security environment by dispersing into smaller units, reducing their territorial ambitions, and focusing on asymmetric attacks that exploited the limited capacity of Malian security forces and international peacekeepers. The violence shifted over time into central Mali and spread to neighboring countries including Burkina Faso and Niger, suggesting that military intervention had displaced rather than solved the underlying jihadist threat. The ransom economy that Abu Zeid helped build diminished significantly after 2013 as kidnapping became more difficult, and as international pressure to stop payments increased. AQIM and related groups shifted toward other revenue sources including drug trafficking through Saharan routes, taxation of local populations in areas where they maintained influence, and smuggling of various commodities. The financial infrastructure created during the ransom era provided capital that could be invested in these alternative activities. The destruction of cultural heritage sites in Timbuktu that occurred under Abu Zeid's governance became the subject of international legal proceedings. The International Criminal Court prosecuted Ahmed al-Faqi al-Mahdi, a member of Ansar Dine, for his role in destroying the shrines, resulting in a conviction and 9-year sentence. The prosecution established destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime under international law and demonstrated that individuals could be held accountable for such actions. Reconstruction of the destroyed shrines began after AQIM's departure from Timbuktu, with international funding supporting efforts to rebuild the structures using traditional methods and materials. The reconstruction raised questions about authenticity and the meaning of heritage when structures are deliberately destroyed and then rebuilt rather than preserved continuously over centuries. The physical rebuilding addressed some of the damage, but could not fully restore what had been lost. The broader Sahel region experienced escalating violence in the years following Abu Zeid's death. Groups affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State established themselves and competed for influence. The competition between different jihadist organizations produced additional violence as groups fought each other in addition to fighting government forces and international troops. The fragmentation of the jihadist landscape made it more difficult to address the threat through targeted leadership strikes like the one that eliminated Abu Zeid, as no single leader's removal significantly degraded the overall jihadist capacity. Mali experienced multiple coups in the years after Operation Serval, suggesting ongoing instability in the political system that created vulnerabilities jihadist groups could exploit. The inability to establish stable democratic governance, combined with continuing economic challenges and ethnic tensions, meant that the conditions that allowed AQIM to gain influence in 2012 persisted in various forms. The expansion of violence into Burkina Faso represented a particularly troubling development. Burkina Faso had been relatively stable and had avoided the worst of the Sahelian jihadist violence. However, beginning in 2015 and accelerating thereafter, jihadist groups began conducting attacks in northern Burkina Faso and eventually expanded operations into other parts of the country. The violence displaced hundreds of thousands of people and overwhelmed the capacity of Burkinabe security forces to respond effectively. Niger similarly experienced increased jihadist activity despite substantial American and French military presence focused on counterterrorism operations. Attacks on military bases killed dozens of Nigerian and international soldiers. Kidnappings of foreign aid workers and contractors continued. The persistence of jihadist violence, despite significant counterterrorism investment, raised questions about whether military approaches alone could address the threat, or whether broader governance and development interventions were necessary. The pattern across the Sahel suggested that jihadist organizations had successfully adapted to the post-intervention security environment. Rather than attempting to hold territory and govern populations in ways that made them vulnerable to military intervention, groups focused on guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, and maintaining influence in remote areas where government presence was minimal. This approach sacrificed the propaganda value and resource access that came with territorial control, but reduced vulnerability to the kind of military operation that eliminated Abu Zeid. Abu Zeid's trajectory from political activist to insurgent to enforcer to governor to hunted militant illustrates how individuals move through roles within violent non-state organizations, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining core commitments that shape their decisions across contexts. His early activism with the FIS demonstrated engagement with political process and willingness to work within democratic frameworks when they appeared viable. The military coup that annulled the election eliminated that path and created the conditions for his radicalization. The transition from politics to violence was not unique to him, but reflected a broader pattern among thousands of Algerians who concluded that the state would not permit Islamic governance through peaceful means. The choice to join the GSPC rather than remain with the GIA reflected some degree of selectivity about targets and methods, a willingness to reject the GIA's indiscriminate violence in favor of a more focused insurgency. Whether this reflected genuine moral qualms about civilian casualties or simply tactical calculation about what approach would be more effective is unclear from available evidence. The GSPC's eventual merger with Al-Qaeda demonstrated that the break with the GIA was not a rejection of jihadist ideology, but a refinement of approach. His rise within AQIM to command of a major brigade and eventually to governance of Timbuktu showed organizational capacity and the trust he earned from the leadership through demonstrated loyalty. Commanders who follow orders reliably gain opportunities for advancement. Abu Zeid's willingness to implement difficult or unpopular directives made him valuable to leaders who needed someone to enforce discipline and carry out actions that more autonomous commanders might refuse. The limitations of the enforcer role became apparent when circumstances required flexibility and local adaptation. The rigid implementation of Sharia in Timbuktu generated international opposition that contributed to intervention momentum. A more flexible administrator might have achieved AQIM's objectives more effectively by moving more slowly and building broader local support before imposing controversial policies. Abu Zeid's commitment to ideological consistency prevented the kind of pragmatic adaptation that might have extended AQIM's control. His death in combat rather than capture avoided questions about accountability and what information he might have provided if interrogated. The elimination of a senior commander through military action provided immediate tactical benefits, but foreclosed intelligence opportunities that capture might have enabled. The trade-off between the certainty of death and the potential value of interrogation is one that commanders make repeatedly in counterterrorism operations, with different calculus applying depending on circumstances. The fact that AQIM survived his death and that the broader jihadist threat in the Sahel intensified in subsequent years suggests that individual commanders, even effective ones, are less important to organizational survival than the conditions that allow such organizations to recruit, fund operations, and position themselves as alternatives to weak or predatory states. Military operations that eliminate leaders without addressing underlying political, economic, and governance challenges produce temporary disruption but not lasting resolution. The kidnapping economy that Abu Zeid helped build demonstrated how terrorist organizations can exploit vulnerabilities in the international system, specifically the gap between official no-concessions policies and actual government behavior when citizens are held hostage. The tens of millions of euros that flowed to AQIM through ransoms enabled the organization's military buildup and territorial expansion, creating a direct link between decisions made in European capitals about whether to pay ransoms and the security situation in the Sahel years later. The shrine destruction that occurred under his governance demonstrated how ideological commitments can drive decisions that undermine tactical objectives. The destruction provided no military advantage, generated international opposition, and damaged relationships with local populations who valued the shrines. The decision to proceed reflected Abu Zeid's prioritization of religious correctness as he understood it over strategic calculation about what would maximize AQIM's chances of maintaining control. The DNA confirmation that ended speculation about his fate illustrated the importance of definitive identification in confirming high-value target eliminations. Without biometric confirmation, uncertainty about whether a targeted individual actually died can persist for months or years, complicating efforts to assess the impact of operations and potentially allowing rumors of survival to sustain movements beyond the leader's actual death. The story of Abdelhamid Abu Zeid is the story of how organizational loyalty, ideological rigidity, and operational competence combined to create a commander who was effective within a specific context, but whose approach contained limitations that became apparent when circumstances changed. His rise reflected AQIM's needs during a period of expansion. His methods generated both successes and vulnerabilities. His death removed one enforcer from the organization, but did not resolve the broader challenges that allowed jihadist groups to operate in the Sahel. The pursuit that ended in the Amatete Valley eliminated a particular threat, but left unaddressed the conditions that produced him, and that continue to produce similar figures in the region today. The enforcer's role in jihadist organizations reveals tensions between maintaining ideological purity and achieving practical objectives. Abu Zeid's unwavering commitment to implementing AQIM's vision made him reliable but inflexible. His executions of hostages